Okay, so this is our last group for today. And we are going to be looking at the white helmets. This policy lab was focusing on this organization that was founded in Syria, and they've been doing some really interesting work in a very tumultuous time, given the events in Syria that took place during their work on the policy lab. So I'd like to welcome this team. It is Lilian, Camille, Cyrus, Zara, and Fayez. Take it away. We're very much looking forward to your presentation.
مساء الخير جميعا. شكرا لوجودكم هنا. Good afternoon, esteemed panel members and colleagues. My name is Fayez, and I'm pleased to be presenting on behalf of the Policy Lab team, sponsored by the White Helmets, along with Camille, Cyrus, Zara, and Lily. In today's presentation, we will walk you through the 4 key parts of our research: context, key insights, summary of what we found in the patterns we identified, recommendations and cost assessment, where we will introduce the pillars of our policy interventions, starting with the drone early warning system. Our project began with a complex and urgent question: how can we protect civilians and humanitarian aid workers from suicide drones in conflict zones? We adopted a multi-phased research process to answer this central research question. We hope by the end of this presentation we'll leave you with a clear understanding of the urgency of the issue and actionable policy solutions needed to protect those most at risk. Now, before I move into the context, I would like to ask, how many of you have seen a drone up close? Okay, quite a few. Thanks for sharing. This is an example of commercial drones that can be outfitted with explosive ordnance. And these drones are used to target civilians and humanitarian aid workers in conflict zones. And here is the sound that terrorizes civilians on a daily basis in those contexts. Ladies and gentlemen, civilians and humanitarian aid workers are increasingly targeted in conflict zones. And suicide drones, because of their automation, accessibility, and affordability, have become a weapon of choice for both the state and non-state actors. While they're often described as precision tools, their proliferation has not decreased civilian casualties, quite the opposite. Let me illustrate this with a recent case. In February 2024, in Kherson Oblast, Ukraine, a Russian suicide drone struck an aid convoy, despite the convoy being clearly marked and having passed 2 military checkpoints. 2 aid workers were killed and several others were injured. A local hospital staff said, quote, "Russian troops treat civilians like a safari, dropping suicide drone explosives from the sky as if in a video game." This is haunting, but it reflects a broader trend. The rise in drone use has accelerated since the so-called war on terror began in 2001, and the second stage we are now in is far more complex. Multiple actors, commercial technologies, loitering munitions like suicide drones are being used to target civilians and humanitarian aid workers. And for this project, we focused on suicide drones, which we define as drones, commercial and military grade, outfitted with explosives and designed to explode on impact. We focused on suicide drones in Syria because the White Helmets operated there and they were increasingly targeted by drones. And these drones are not fully autonomous. They function as flying improvised explosive devices known as IEDs. And their appeal lies in their affordability, minimal exposure of troops, and ease of deployment. But the very same features that make them attractive also make them hard to regulate. While drones have dual uses for both destruction and humanitarian aid, like some organizations are using drones to deliver medicine to affected communities, their increasing use requires us to ask, how can we regulate without undermining the beneficial uses? This is one of the tensions that our policy recommendations try to address. Now let's move to some visual evidence from this research. In Syria, where the White Helmets operated, 275 suicide drones were recorded between January to November 2024. 4 people were killed and 59 others were injured. Women and children were also among those who suffered injuries. Most of these attacks happened in Idlib, followed by Aleppo and Homa. Homes and agricultural fields were targeted, but the deadliest locations were markets, roads, and other places. But this is not just what happened in Syria. In Ukraine, the use of suicide drones has exploded. This graph shows the number of civilians who were killed and injured. And the purple line shows the share of civilians who were killed and injured from January 2024 to January 2025. This is a 5-fold increase in just 1 year. The blue bars show the number of people who were killed and injured by short-range drones, and the yellow bars shows the number of people who were killed and injured by other weapons. We also experience similar patterns in situations in other contexts, like in Ethiopia, Somalia, Myanmar. Pakistan and India have also used suicide drones in the recent conflict. In these contexts, states and non-state actors are using suicide drones for targeted killing, surveillance, and intimidation. But urgent actions are needed to protect civilians and humanitarian aid workers because they continue to bear the brunt of violence in these settings. Thank you. Now I will give the floor to Cyrus to walk us through the key insights.
Thank you, Fayez. I'll now be presenting the 4 key insights from our research which most influenced our recommendation choice. So the first key insight is about impunity and enforcement gaps. The insight here is that while the targeting of civilians by suicide drones is prohibited under international law, it is the enforcement and accountability mechanisms which remain weak. When we began our research, it wasn't altogether clear to us whether or not there were excellent legal pathways that would apply specifically to suicide drones. But after consulting with various stakeholders, industry experts, specifically legal scholars, they informed us that while the current and political landscape did not lend itself well to the amendment of existing treaties like the Arms Trade Treaty or the creation of a new universal treaty or convention specifically about suicide drones, that the creation of such a treaty or convention was not actually necessary. This is because the use and proliferation of suicide drones is already regulated through high-level legal frameworks such as international humanitarian law and human rights law. More specifically, suicide-class drones must still abide by the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution as substantiated in the Geneva Convention and its additional protocols. The principle of distinction mandates differentiating between military and civilian objects. Proportionality mandates that civilian harm must not be excessive relative to the gained military advantage. And finally, the principle of precaution requires parties to avoid or minimize incidental civilian harm during warfare. Additional legal pathways also exist through the potential application of conventions like the Convention on Conventional Weapons. The point then of this insight is that drones which target humanitarian aid workers and civilians clearly violate high-level legal standards, but enforcement must be strengthened. The question can then be posed, what about an absolute prohibition on suicide drones? An absolute prohibition is not possible because, as Fayez alluded to earlier, suicide drones are dual use. There is no moral valence in the object of the drone itself. They can be used either for commercial or military purposes. They may be instruments of aid or instruments of warfare. And so an absolute ban discounts the successful and lawful military application of suicide drones. We have seen a recent use case in Ukraine as their government used suicide drones in self-defense against the threat of Russian annexation. This brings us to our second key insight about a disintegrating rules-based order. This insight recognizes that recent power shifts in the global order have slowed the momentum of international governance and accelerated the decline of international legal norms. We have seen major states withdrawing from multiple bilateral and multilateral agreements. A case-in-point example and a good comparator here to the regulation of suicide drones would be the Ottawa Treaty, which offered a complete prohibition on anti-personnel landmines. Recently, we've seen multiple Baltic countries, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, Poland, and most recently Finland having withdrawn or expressed their intent to withdraw from the Ottawa Treaty, also due to the threat of Russian annexation. While there remain caveats about how landmines compare to suicide drones having an explicit dual-use purpose and landmines being a more blatant, indiscriminate weapon, the broader point still stands. There is a self-selection bias in treaty participation. This bleeds into our third key insight about the efficacy of civilian self-protection. We have observed that civilian-led reconnaissance and deterrence initiatives often provide the strongest protection from suicide drone threats in conflict zones. Examples of such civilian-led protection programs include the Ukrainian EPPO app, which is an SMS application led by local on-the-ground actors who supply inputs of drone sightings through their phone and then have alerts sent in mass to civilians and aid workers to alert them of any drones entering their airspace. The drone early warning system of our first recommendation drew inspiration from the now defunct White Helmet Sentry program, also known as the Sentinel Project. This initiative installed 426 sensor devices across 261 locations, mainly in the northwest of Syria, Aleppo, Idlib, Hama, and it succeeded in protecting an estimated 812,000 people from incoming drone attacks. While such self-protection initiatives are efficient and effective, they are not without their shortcomings. This leads us to our fourth key insight regarding humanitarian coordination. Our research proved that coordinated data collection and standardized reporting guidelines are crucial for civilian protection. While efforts exist in consolidating data on drone attacks through NGOs and nonprofits like Air Wars, Insecurity Insights, and Drone Wars, there remains to be a standardized, centralized database specifically about suicide drones. We need to track drones to most effectively control their use, so lack of alignment is an impediment to deterrence. If we consider safety from violence as a public good, failure to coordinate data collection is a collective action problem. By proposing the drone early warning system in our first recommendation, we tried to learn from and build on the limitations of the White Helmet Sentry project. As the targeting of civilians and aid workers has become an increasingly strategic tactic in warfare, having only one organization responsible for reporting on suicide drone sightings makes a group like the White Helmets an overly exposed target. We need to disaggregate the responsibility across multiple aid agencies to better track, understand, and control this growing threat. Having laid out the major insights of our research, I'll now turn it over to Camille to go into more detail about our recommendations.
Thank you. So now that we have an understanding of the problem at hand, let's look at what can be done about this. So I'll be giving an overview of our recommendations, how they fit together, and I'll introduce you to the first recommendation, the drone early warning system model. So obviously no single recommendation can really fully address this threat. And that's why our recommendations are intended to form a comprehensive three-pillar strategy that balances principles with pragmatism. So the first recommendation is the drone early warning system model, which is intended to provide immediate life-saving protection using technology and coordination. The second recommendation and pillar is legal accountability, which tackles impunity through legal action and reform. The third recommendation is private sector regulation, and this targets drone supply chains and through geofencing technology and trade controls. So together, these recommendations address both the symptoms and the causes of this threat and blend bottom-up protection like early warning systems with top-down accountability and industry reform. So the first recommendation is the drone early warning system model. And it's a pragmatic, scalable, and civilian-centered system that leverages technology with coordination and data to reduce harm from suicide drone attacks. And the core objective of this recommendation is to detect, assess, and communicate imminent drone threats, giving civilians and aid workers the critical time and information that they need to take protective action. And the drone early warning system model contains 4 key components and is intended to be piloted by a humanitarian organization in a conflict zone. The first element of the drone early warning system model is the drone threat risk assessment framework. So risk assessment frameworks are key components of most humanitarian organizations' security risk management protocols, but we didn't find any related specifically to suicide drones and limited related to drones specifically. So this framework, tailored to suicide drones, helps humanitarian organizations assess their exposure and their vulnerabilities, combining threat intelligence with situational awareness, physical defenses, and response protocols, ensuring preparedness before an attack occurs. The second component of the drone early warning system model is drone detection technology. And this utilizes hybrid sensor systems like RF scanners, thermal cameras, and acoustic sensors. And as Cyrus said, some low-cost options already exist, like through the White Helmet's Sentry system, and these can be adapted for field deployment in other conflict contexts. This drone detection technology would also be coupled with AI prediction models, and this helps identify drone trajectories and potential targets. The third component is an information and communication technology platform, which would be fed by the drone detection technology, where the platform would send real-time alerts via SMS, radio, or loudspeakers to civilians and humanitarian aid workers, giving people that window of warning to evacuate or shelter. And the fourth component is a centralized drone attack database, collecting standardized incident data from multiple different organizations, and that data can ultimately be used to inform advocacy efforts and even legal accountability processes down the road. We suggest that it be managed by potentially a more central organization like the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, or smaller NGOs doing similar work already, like Insecurity Insight. But together, these tools are intended to form a closed-loop system from detection to warning, reporting, and ultimately prevention. And this recommendation is aligned with some of our key insights that Cyrus discussed. So this recommendation responds directly to our research by normalizing and standardizing incident reporting across organizations. It reduces that individual risk to any one actor and promotes stronger humanitarian collaboration. But most importantly, this recommendation really aligns with the insight that empowering civilians and humanitarian aid workers with timely and actionable information is really one of the most effective and realistic strategies in the current climate of legal and geopolitical paralysis. But these recommendations, of course, come with their own set of risks and limitations. So for one, in conflict zones, internet and mobile networks and often electricity grids are unreliable or even deliberately disrupted. Second, early warning tech platforms are vulnerable to both deliberate misinformation and false alarms, which can trigger unnecessary panic or undermine public trust in the system. Third, humanitarian actors, local authorities, and international organizations often operate with different mandates, budgets, and levels of legitimacy in the eyes of communities. And these dynamics can hinder coordination and really could create resistance to adopting a unified system if it's perceived as being dominated by a single actor. But underlying all of this, all of these risks and even their mitigation strategies is a deeper issue of trust. And this is what we heard over and over again in our interviews and in our research, that Syria, Gaza, Ukraine, and elsewhere, humanitarians have evidently been targeted. And that makes it difficult to trust that it's actually safe to share any information about your operations at all. So rebuilding trust is really the foundation for collective action in this protection of civilians effort and the only path towards an effective early warning system. So in closing, the drone early warning system is a model that empowers civilians and is firmly aligned with the White Helmet's operational legacy. Thank you, and now Zara will explain the second key pillar.
So I will address our second recommendation, which stems from one of the main key insights of this project, that the use of suicide drone is, in the context of armed conflict, is regulated and governed by international legal mechanisms and however, enforcement and accountability are lacking. This recommendation is specifically focused on Syria because we believe any legal accountability process needs to take its unique circumstances and condition into account. That's why we recommend to the White Helmet to pursue a dual legal pathway, which has two components. First, we recommend to the White Helmet and their legal experts to support and prepare legal cases against the Assad regime and senior officials in a court of universal jurisdiction. What is universal jurisdiction? Universal jurisdiction is a specific form of extraterritorial jurisdiction that builds on the idea and the fact that there are some serious crimes, such as crimes against humanity and war crime, that the states have the obligations, have the capacity, and have the specific criminal code to prosecute offenders, even if offender is not national to that state, or even if crime committed elsewhere. This is essential step because when Syria's national court capacity is limited and it's in transition as it is right now. The second part of the recommendation is to ratify the Rome Statute, a treaty that established international criminal court. The objective behind the whole recommendation is first to deter future suicide drone attacks targeting civilian and humanitarian aid workers, and also to reduce the systematic impunity of perpetrator and to reduce the recurrence of such a crime in Syria and globally. So, why we offer universal jurisdiction? First of all, it offers the most accessible and feasible path to the justice in the current situation in Syria. Because Syria is not a signatory and a party to the Rome Statute, and the UN Security Council referral to the International Criminal Court repeatedly vetoed by member states such as Russia and China. So when the other legal mechanisms are blocked, universal jurisdiction remained as one of the most feasible options. Additionally, the White Helmet, they already gathered information, data, and collect evidences that meet the universal jurisdiction standards. However, without a specific legal forum to file the case. This part of the recommendation provide them or offer them with a concrete legal destination. Also, we think that the universal jurisdiction is a pragmatic solution. Among several potential universal jurisdiction, we recommend Germany because of the Koblenz trial that is a precedent case in 2020, and they were prosecuted two Syrian officials from previous regime, and it was a successful case. So this was again a proof for the functionality of the universal jurisdiction. With all being said, we recognize that universal jurisdiction alone may not be a comprehensive solution. Yes, it provides a short to medium term feasibility and enforceable route. However, it relies on foreign legal system, and we believe over the long term, legal accountability should be established into Syria's national legal system. That's where the ratification of Rome Statute becomes essential, because it brings Syria into international legal system. Also, even if the full ratification is not immediately possible, the Article 12.3 of the Rome Statute allows Syria to accept International Criminal Court jurisdiction over specific cases, even if without becoming a full state party. So this part of the recommendation again offer a viable option to the recommendation. We believe that dual legal pathway is a feasible recommendation. However, it comes with some challenges. First, the evidences involve the criminal evidences involve the suicide drone cases are very sensitive, they are complex to verify, and they are time and resource consuming. Second, in a transition government may face a competing priorities such as economic and security stability, also governance rebuilding and society healing. This may delay the justice a little bit in a current context. Finally, in a post-conflict situation, this kinds of legal advocacy work may consider as a form of political act imposed from outside. So it needs to be timed perfectly and aligned with national priorities. With all being said, we believe that legal tools exist, evidences are strong, so therefore, pursuing legal accountability must be strategic, exclusive, and context-aware. And with that being said, I will pass it to Lily for the third recommendation.
I will present the third pillar of our set of recommendations. Here we are proposing for states to commit in a declaration to strengthen regulation for the commercial drone industry through two mechanisms, geofencing and trace controls. So geofencing offers a practical solution to prevent drones from accessing critical areas. Basically, it's an imaginary fence, and the drone tries to get in, but then it will be forced to return land or return to their pilot. As you may see in the picture, there is a map of Aleppo, Syria, with restricted zone. In red is a no-fly zone and other restrictions. This was done for DJI, the same manufacturer of the drone that we showed before, is the main drone manufacturer, represents 70% of the total share, and we think this might be extended by mandatory regulation. Here we are proposing a multi-partnership effort led by offices in the United Nations. But it has limitations. For example, we think that humanitarian organizations may be reluctant to share sensitive information. Some cases have happened, like the United Nations, the confliction mechanism in Syria, where they share information of their locations, and then there were subsequent attacks in Idlib. But we are proposing to mitigate this by preventing sharing information to states that are involved in specific conflicts. Trade control. Here we propose for states to report imports and exports and transactions of drone sales. We think that increasing transparency will help to prevent the unlawful use of drones. We are also proposing the United Nations as an office in the Office of Disarmament Affairs to lead this effort, but also has limitations, right? For example, drones can be built by modular parts, which makes it difficult to build them. And also, main drone producer states may be reluctant to participate in this type of efforts. But the same happens with the Arms Trade Treaty, where United States and North Russia are part of it, and they account for more than 50% of the total weapon export. However, there are 116 states participating in this treaty, and there has been effective and show effective results. Regarding the cost assessment and the implementation, our set of recommendations is estimated in about 15.3 million Canadian dollars. The main cost is in the first recommendation, the drone early warning system. This is because it requires devices, software, a pilot, and it's a 4 years implementation. The other two accounts for a total of 10% and are mostly human resources, legal fees, advocacy efforts, and documentation and preparation of the recommendations. Having said that, in conclusion, state and non-state actors are using suicide drones to attack and terrorize civilians and humanitarian aid workers. We are proposing a set of 3 recommendations to address this threat. The trend is predicted to continue. It has been increasing since 2001 during the war on terror, and the trend is predicted that will continue. So we are proposing to address this, first aiming to increase international attention, and later with these 3 set of recommendations that are built from a pragmatic and a principled approach. The first one, drone early warning system, intends to provide immediate response by detecting, assessing threat, and empowering civilians to protect themselves. Legal accountability pursues justice before the universal jurisdiction, along with long-term solutions by advocating and supporting the Syrian transitional government to ratify the Rome status. And third, industry regulation. We propose to strengthen regulation through geofencing and trade control. Before finishing, we would like to acknowledge that the context of our project has been evolving fast. Last year at the end, Assad regime ended, and more recently on June 3rd, White Helmet's General Assembly decided to dissolve the NGO and fully integrate the Syrian transitional government. Although our recommendations direct to the White Helmets, we think they remain relevant for different humanitarian organizations in different conflict settings. We would like to thank you, our sponsor, the White Helmets, Alexandra Busky, Sami Mohamed, our coach, Pearl Eliadis, and also all the stakeholders, interviewees, and everybody who support us in this project. And we open the floor for questions.
Fantastic photo at the end. Wonderful, thank you. And there were more of you, so you had to really think about your speaking time. So well done for staying in the time. Judges, over to you. John's going to kick us off.
Hi, great work. Very, very interesting. I was involved in sponsoring Syrian family a few years ago to settle in Ottawa, and I've watched Syrian affairs since then, although I've never been there. It was ambiguous to me whether the mandate of your project required a focus specifically on Syria, or whether you were doing general work that would be of relevance anywhere that suicide drones are used. Just a point of curiosity on my part. Now, I went beyond the executive summary and read into your report because I was quite interested in this. Were there ideas beyond your recommendations that you were thinking about but that didn't quite make it to recommendation level? I was particularly interested in your page on ideas for future research. It seemed to me that there's a lot of fertile ground there, and it sounded like you'd done some thinking about it.
Yeah, I can address those points. So the first, to answer the first question, thank you for raising that. Our approach was to use Syria as a case study because of the prevalence of the use of suicide drones in that region. But as we were working through the project with the shifting mandate, the shifting threat landscape, we sort of reconsidered. We thought maybe we make it more generalizable, get rid of the white helmet affiliation. But in the end, we ended up sticking with Syria because we think it's a fertile ground. It's a perfect sort of setup as a use case. Our sponsor, even when we suggested implementing a pilot project, right now it's a little too recent. They're trying, the new caretaker government is focusing on economic regeneration, rebuilding capacity. So to do a pilot project or anything in Syria right now is not the time for it. But we did certainly consider the idea of making it more general, but we thought Syria was the perfect use case, and we were associated, our sponsor was the White Helmets, so it was slightly mandated to us. And the second point, were there any technology systems that we considered, especially for the drone early warning system? We had met with a freelance researcher through our sponsor. Her name was Fayne Greenwood. She's a specialist on drones. Talking to her, she had suggested something called a UTM, an unmanned traffic management system, which is sort of what airports use just to see anything that enters the airspace, what they call below visual line of sight objects that enter. We just figured that wouldn't be feasible for a local organization like the White Helmets. And there's a lot of disruption in terms of the funding sector for aid organizations right now. So we ended up dropping that recommendation, but up until midway through our research, we did think we would probably pursue that. But ultimately, we figured going with more acoustic, optical sensors, something that is more feasible, that was the solution we settled on. But thank you for the question.
Brenda, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. It's such a moving topic. It's just very heartwarming to hear you tackle something so difficult and so emotional. I found it very interesting to hear about some technical possibilities because it has felt to me like such a sense of helplessness and hopelessness when we talk about using drones that are killing people. And I hadn't heard about kind of the early warning system or about geofencing possibilities. So that was terrific to hear. You know, there are some things going on. But where my real struggle on this whole issue is with our reliance on international humanitarian law. And it feels like for a long time there was a world order that said, you know, we must respect the agreements that we've signed on to and our commitment and our obligations under international humanitarian law, with a few exceptions, all, you know, in war-torn countries. But it feels more generally like international humanitarian law is kind of collapsing. And most of our efforts now are around not improving international humanitarian law, but kind of advocating for people to follow what they've already, accepted as their obligations. So it's kind of worrying. But that leads me to, in this particular case, where you're talking about trying to use this project to kind of strengthen obligations under international humanitarian law around enforcement and accountability, and that it's actually possible in this particular case to imagine IHL actually moving more quickly. So instead of, looking back 20 years on something that happened a long time ago, I would think in this particular case, you could actually imagine using the provisions in IHL to move something more quickly around enforcement and accountability. So that's a long introduction to say, do you see using the legal remedies that you talked about, could you see that happening quite quickly, not just on implementation, but then on enforcement?
So thank you so much for the question. During this project and this research, yes, we think a lot about if it's possible or not. The main statement of at least one of the main key insights of this project, as you mentioned, is not that we don't have enough legal regulations or international treaties or rules. However, how it enforced and how it, compliance is the problem. Yes, it can. We can have new treaties or resolution, and we thought about that to have a new resolution or amendment to a resolution, but in if about this specific case that we have, we thought that for this moment we need to only focus on what we have and use that, or maybe strengthen that to not solving the issue, at least trying to strengthen the regulations and enforcement, regulation. To strengthen the enforcement and accountability. Thank you so much for the question.
Any others want to come in on that question? No? Kyle, yeah.
So I have about 10 questions here. Just kidding, folks. I really liked your presentation. You gave a really good overview of how these technology are being used in modern conflicts, from Ethiopia to Somalia to Myanmar to Ukraine, Syria, and it's having a heavier impact on aid workers and civilians. I like the idea of this early drone warning system. I think that's something that's been missing. We're seeing people develop drones to attack armies and others, but we haven't seen as much about how they can be deployed for good and for protecting civilians. I'd be curious to get more information about this early drone warning system. Is it simply to alert people when something's incoming, or would it also have any drone jamming technology to stop these drones from entering territory? You also mentioned something about intelligence integration, or was a problem. And I just want to know what kind of intelligence, and just maybe just say if it's for a humanitarian purpose. Anything mentioning intelligence could be seen as having a military perspective. So I'm just curious if that came up in your discussions. And another question, I just wondered if this is starting to be deployed in Syria. That's my understanding. But how much area can be covered from this early warning system? Are we talking about protecting a city, protecting a region of a country, half a country? I mean, what is the capacity for this to provide kind of real protection from drones in modern warfare? Thank you.
Thank you, Kyle. Great question. Oh, sorry, I moved the mic. Great question. When we assessed this challenge question, we evaluated counter-drone measures. They are roughly divided in three: detection, identification, and jamming. And neutralization is called. And jamming is among the neutralization measures. Why we focus on detection and identification? Because the neutralization measure may hinder or compromise the neutrality principle of humanitarian organizations. So we didn't opt for that option. And also jamming systems, they rely on electromagnetic signals that usually mess up with telecommunication signals that are crucial in conflict zones. So we decided to use detection and identification measures. Regarding the areas, I think that will depend mostly on the sensors, where are located, how is the range that they can identify, because then when you send the message to the people, SMS and those platforms can reach more people, right? But the sensors are the crucial part on that point.
Yeah, I'll just add to that, to Lily's point, the limit is sort of the limit of how incrementally you employ the sensors, the devices. So in Syria, the Sentry program that they had is now defunct. in part because they don't need it. There isn't such a threat. There's a change of the regime. But they had about 426 devices across 261 locations, but this was all sort of consolidated just in the northwest of Syria because that's where most atrocities are happening, in Hama and Idlib and Aleppo. But that's why we sort of coupled this idea with the geofencing so that there's a built-in sort of automatic land or return to sender function within the drone itself. So if there is a false positive, false negative, somebody reports a drone that hasn't in fact entered the airspace or they've missed a drone, there's other sort of deterrence mechanisms. Yeah. Thank you.
Any more questions from the jury for now? Okay, we have our sponsor here, Alexandra, so we'll let you ask the first question or make the first set of comments, however you'd like to start us off.
Okay, thank you very much. So I want to firstly just pay tribute to the team. They've had to, when we first started this project, we got in touch because we were waking up every day worried about whether or not someone was going to die from a drone attack. And it was a very stressful time, and we'd seen drone attacks increase from 0 at the beginning of 2024 to more than 200 by November 2024. It was already the second most used weapon against civilians. So it was a very, very stressful time, and I want to pay tribute to the team for sticking with the project, because I think that even with the change in context in Syria and with the sponsor organization, which will be later in the year, the value of what you've done isn't undermined by this change of context. It's still a very important issue, as you've shown in the contextual section. So I think my question is, from the research that you've done, what is the one or two top countries where you would want to see this this three-pronged approach happening? If it's not in Syria, where else would you want to see it? Thanks.
So we had a discussion about that, and thank you for your question and thank you for your comments. It's really, really appreciated. So we've thought that perhaps a good first pilot would be Ukraine, because it has somewhat similar threat landscape to what was happening in Syria. It has, significant state capacity to maybe help fund some of this initiative. Ukraine also, it implemented a crowdsourcing of drones from civilians to actually help counter the threats that they were receiving from Russian suicide drones. So, essentially, the Sentry system was, as you know, being piloted or was in the process of being piloted in Yemen and Nigeria. And this Sentry system, what we've adapted and expanded upon for the drone early warning system model, can't be directly exported, but it can be adapted to other contexts. So I think some of the largest fatalities that we were seeing outside of our research in Syria was in Ukraine. In Kherson, we've seen many stories coming out of there of Russian drones attacking Ukrainian civilians there. So I think that, the combination of their state capacity and the fact that Ukraine itself is not involved in attacking civilians with suicide drones helps to implement some of these other measures that we said, when humanitarian organizations may not want to reveal their locations or their operations because the state is the one actually perpetrating the crimes. But in the situation in Ukraine, generally speaking, what we found that Ukraine is not doing so. So, that was our idea. Mm-hmm.
Other questions from the audience? Anyone wants to ask? Elijah, yeah, and then Tim. And Diana. And Jacob. Okay. We got a few.
Thank you. So my question is actually for you, Fayez. As I've gotten to know you over the course of the program, I know that you're someone who has spent extensive time in conflict-ridden zones. So in your opinion, what is the essential thing that humanitarian organizations would need to do to ensure that you guys can get this drone early warning system up and running?
Thank you, Elijah. That's an excellent question. I would say trust. Trust building is very important in order to run the drone early warning system in today's conflict zones. And we understand that the civil society landscape of one conflict zone is different than the other. And we recommend that humanitarian organizations working in these settings should have very close coordination with local actors. I mean, their strategic priorities should focus on localization. Working with local civil society organizations would be helpful, as well as with local government structures would help them very much to have close coordination mechanisms. But in the meantime, it should be a civilian-centered process. The experiences, perceptions, and needs of local people should drive the design and the implementation of this system. And that would be very much helpful in terms of local community building ownership. That would also help you from the sustainability perspective. A long-term viability here is also important. So yes, trust, coordination, and of course, funding. And these days we are experiencing serious funding cuts. And for this project, we really need funding to run it and even pilot it. But at the pilot stage, not even at the design stage, local communities should be involved. That would be very, very much important. Thank you. I hope I've answered your question.
Tim.
Yeah, thanks. That was a disturbing but also very thoughtful presentation. I guess I was wondering, I mean, you talked about the dual-use nature. Okay, you talked about the dual-use nature of the drones, and then you had some solutions like the private sector regulation. I sort of wondered how those two would mesh, like whether you can design the how you think of designing the regulation to I mean, can you discriminate between the drones that are coming in, for protection, and the ones that are coming in for terror? I mean, that's kind of how I'm sure this is something you've thought of. So I was sort of interested in understanding your thinking on that.
Maybe I can start. Thank you, Tim. Regarding trade control, we imagine something similar to the Arms Trade Treaty, where registry of transactions are made. So if there is, I guess, or not, maybe that is the word, but if the provider thinks that the weapons they are selling, they are being used in an unlawful way, they are mandated to restrict the sales, or they should do that and to prevent their unlawful use of them. So similar could be done with the drone cases. For example, DGI, we saw a letter that recently was published for Human Rights Watch. They asked them, DGI, what they are doing to prevent their unlawful use of their devices. And they say that they, of course, don't intend that their devices and their drones are used in an unlawful manner. They prevented the sales in Ukraine and Russia. However, they say also that they cannot control the sales through intermediaries as like Amazon and other platforms. So this could help to restrict this transaction or increase transparency at the end to prevent their unlawful use of those initiatives.
You're holding the manufacturer responsible for how the drones are being used then?
No, that is the actual case because there are absence of regulations. But with regulations, states that are committed to do this should implement penalizations for force them or commit them to accomplish this. And the states are the ones who are reporting this. So sellers should provide information to states, and then the states provide that information. Similar to what is done in Arms Trade Treaty. And regarding geofencing, yes, that is a difficult issue to discriminate, but we are proposing an AI system that detects threat of drone's trajectory. So they are like these neuronal systems are fed with incidents to determine if the drone trajectory and the place where are getting close it's representing a threat to the critical zone and the humanitarian facility.
Okay, Diana?
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello. Good. Okay. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. It showed a lot of insight and a lot of care. I'm hoping to take you back to your beginning. I'm curious about your research process, which you touched on a little bit. Given the context, the shifting context, and just a conflict zone, I'm wondering if you faced any limitations in terms of your research and the information available, and just speak to your research process in general.
Thank you, Dan, for that question. So here is how the methodology for this research looked like. First, we conducted a comprehensive literature review, and then we developed our conceptual tools. Then we started conducting interviews with the stakeholders, including but not limited to legal experts, humanitarian staff, and tech professionals, with a focus on Syria, of course. And we also did a comparative review of existing international legal frameworks. Yes, we acknowledge key limitations, such as lack of direct access to civilians who were impacted by suicide drones and classified military drone data, but we compensated with expert input. Thank you.
Jacob, yeah.
Hi, guys. Is this on? Yeah. Amazing presentation. Thank you so much. I learned a lot personally. I have a similar question to Diana about your research methodology, but more on the personal side. You were researching for 6 months very heavy emotional subject matter about atrocities done against civilians in the midst of war zones. Can you talk about how you managed the kind of emotional rigor of your project and how you supported each other through that process?
Thanks, Jacob, for asking this question. I really wanted someone to ask this question. Yeah, it was not easy. But first of all, we learned a lot during this project from all the international kind of regulations, rules, and laws. However, the hardest part was that I remember one day Camille sent us a video of a doctor. He was talking about the events that he was witness, and I literally cried for his words, and I was like, referring to Alexandra's words. Yeah, every day you're waiting something to happen. And personally, this project cannot be more relevant and timely for someone who comes from Middle East. And as you all know, my country and your country are involving a very sad situation. So it was hard to handle it, but I think we did it. And yeah, but if anyone can share.
Sure. I would add a brief note here. So, as you all know, I'm Afghan and will be soon Canadian too. In Afghanistan, we experienced suicide drones. My village was hit by American drone strikes many times, and we lost a large number of civilians. I was young at that time. And I always thought that we really need to do something. That was the main reason that I joined this project, to see that whether or not we can do something to protect civilians. And of course, humanitarian aid workers, great people helping local communities in these conflict zones. So that was one of the main purpose why I joined this project. And I am very happy, accompanied by wonderful people who share their thoughts, findings, insights, especially our coach, Professor Pearl. In terms of emotional support, that's not easy, of course, particularly for people who lived in Canada, have never traveled outside or lived in a conflict zone, but we tried to bring all our insights and experiences together and work on this project together. Thank you, Jacob, for that question.
I've got a question from someone online, Mohammed Diop, and if I'm not mistaken, I think it's an incoming MPP student, Mohammed, I think. Mohammed asks, how did you approach the challenge of communicating such a highly technical and emotional issue like suicide drones to non-expert policymakers or community stakeholders who might influence implementation?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So while we were developing the methodology for this project, we made sure we designed communication tools because we realized how sensitive this topic is. So before arranging the interviews, I can say that we tried to provide a detailed description of what we are looking for. And while we were doing the interviews, if any of the interviewers didn't want to proceed, we just say it's okay. And we tried to focus more on questions that were technical, not very much emotional. As I said, one of the limitations of this project was, of course, that we were not able to reach out to civilians who were impacted by suicide drones, and most of the interviews were with technical professionals. Thank you. Does anyone want to add something?
Maybe add that I think there were two realms of technicality. The legal part that was very challenging, and Pearl helped us. And there we tried to simplify our legal framework with the main international humanitarian legal bodies and also regulations or treaties out there, and the technical part of the device itself. And that one we avoided unnecessary complex terms like radio frequency or mixing with that, and then stick it with simple measures of detection, identification, neutralization. Make it more simple for everybody can understand this.
Can I add one thing?
Yeah, sure.
Also, just want to say, really, really helpful. Lily's an electrical engineer, so really, really helpful. But yeah, there's a lot of confusing terminology around drones. The word drone can mean a million different things. One of our annexes is a long list of all the different types of drones, photos of them, and I think what we were getting at before is trying to understand what kind of attacks are happening where and with what weapons is very difficult because the data just simply doesn't identify suicide drones. We're really just trying to catch up. So even trying to understand the extent of the scope of this specific drone threat was pretty difficult because people use these words in very, very different ways. So that's why we're recommending some really standardized methods of actually reporting these incidents so that we can have a better understanding of what drones are a threat and where. Yeah.
I've got one last question from Emily. I just want to sneak one in too, so you can answer both of ours. In your discussion of risks as you were looking at things, did you discuss in your team the possibility that some of what you were recommending could put civilians at greater risk? Meaning that if they're gathering information, there's been some discussion by legal advisors on international humanitarian law that with new technology, it's harder for civilians sometimes to maintain the principle of distinction because they begin to look like they're participating in hostilities if they're providing information. So I just wondered if this was an issue for you or not, if it came up in your project. Just hold that, because then Emily's going to ask the last question. And then you can answer both so that we try and finish on time.
Great. Thank you so much, and thank you so much really for a really compelling and inspiring presentation. I know this project had a lot of twists and turns, and I think there's so much heart in what you've produced and thoughtfulness. So bravo. I'm glad Jennifer asked the question she asked. I would also say I think the question's very relevant to trust. So I'd be curious to know how that relates to how trust is so central to your report. The question I have is about kind of next steps, and I know that the landscape has been shifting a lot in terms of the organizational landscape, but also the context in which this project started. And I'm curious to know kind of what your thoughts have been in the last couple of weeks about kind of dissemination of this report, given particularly, as been said, the wider applicability to other contexts, non-Syrian contexts, and the real value of the work you've done. So kind of what are the thoughts on the rollout beyond the white helmets and Syria?
Final thoughts.
Yeah, maybe I'll take the first part of your question, which is that, we really struggled a lot with this sort of balance between pragmatic solutions or mitigation strategies and the principled ones, because we found that generally speaking, a lot of organizations seem to just have lost trust that taking any kind of principled approach, like identifying themselves as, you know, an ambulance, that would keep them safe at all. So some of the recommendations that we saw on like how to keep yourself safe from drone attacks is to act like you're not a humanitarian organization. Like that's how you know how deep the loss of trust has been, because we have all of these laws and we have so many super dedicated organizations working on trying to get some kind of accountability for them, but very little has manifested in terms of justice. So yeah, I think that we really tried to find pragmatic ways that organizations and civilians could protect themselves, work in a pragmatic with a pragmatic strategy that doesn't themselves risk becoming seen as combatants, even though a lot of the time humanitarian organizations, they are anyway seen as combatants, regardless of, you know, like how well they're sticking to their principles of neutrality. So yeah, I think that we tried to balance that. Like we said, in some of the recommendations that we considered in terms of neutralizing the threat of a drone, we said that that's not a valid strategy. Yeah.
Okay. On the second question, Emily's question on next steps. Thank you, Camille.
Yeah, so just on the point of potentially how we could disseminate the report, because we consciously chose to tailor the recommendations towards the white helmet, I think you see that most pronounced in our second recommendation. Ratification of the Rome Statute is something that's very specific to Syria. But something like the drone early warning system, we tried to keep the door open so that this sort of recommendation could be grafted into other contexts. But we understand that the mandate of the white helmets themselves is changing. So they're occupying more of an advocacy role right now. Things are still foggy, but when the dust settles, we're hoping that maybe we can use them. This report could be useful for them as part of an information campaign. We understand there's multiple UN resolutions right now, one specifically 2286, which is the first one specifically about humanitarian aid workers. So to have a group like the White Helmets or other civil society organizations, if our report could be useful for them to just sort of promote awareness to the subject, I think that it'd be useful in that setting, if not in others. So yeah, thank you.
Great. Well, terrific to round out our afternoon. Camille, Zara, Cyrus, Fayez, Lilian, congratulations. Really wonderful presentation. Thank you, jury. It was a really, really fascinating discussion that we were able to have together. So well done. Congratulations. That brings us to an end. Stay tuned for part 2. We start promptly at 11:15 tomorrow morning. So we will see you here for the remaining 3 presentations tomorrow. And thanks to everyone who helped this afternoon, in addition to the jury, the tech team, Weston, Natalie, all of you. It's been a wonderful afternoon. So thanks again.